Good day, everybody, and welcome to chapter 8 of the Gospel of John. Thank you for sticking in with it, and thank you for bringing me questions and having discussions with me in church and throughout the week. I deeply appreciate it, and because I enjoy people wrestling with the text and digging into it and getting into it. And I've heard from many of you that this format works very well for your schedule, so I am grateful to hear that. I'll be presenting more throughout the rest of the year, I guess, through this kind of format too. Let me just say a couple of words about what the next few weeks may look like. I don't know yet. If I get my act together by this afternoon, there's a lot on my plate right now, so I'll just share that. But if I get my act together by this afternoon and I get a chance to record another one of these for next week, I will upload it and have it ready to go for next week. But if not, I'm going to be taking the week off due to Holy Week, and so I'll take a small break next week. But unless I get it recorded, so that's where we are for this week, and for possibly next week. Then it'll be fine the week after that, and then I'll need another break because I'm going on a retreat. So this is just a busy month. This is just that type of year. But as I said, if I get my act together, we'll be fine, and you won't even notice a difference. But I just wanted to warn you ahead of time in case I don't. So here we are in chapter 8, and last week I said at the end of chapter 7, the way chapter 8 opens, it might not be an original part of the text. So what did I mean by that? Well, we were in the Festival of the Booths, and that's the narrative that began in chapter 7. And then we take this break with this woman that has been accused of adultery. But then we go immediately back to the Festival of the Booths. Now, the Festival of the Booths was a multi-day event, so it could be that we go back and forth. But I think the original intent was that 7 and 8 were all one narrative. And then this part was added into later. We also know this because the way that things worked is that somebody would write a manuscript, and it would just be one long way of telling the narrative from beginning to end. And then copies were made. So we didn't have a printing press, obviously, so it wasn't like people could rattle off gospels. So they were written on scrolls generally. And so some of the earliest scrolls did not have this narrative in here. So the woman that committed adultery is not in here, but later ones did. And so depending on where the scroll wound up, it could have been that this was an original, and therefore those that got the one version of the scroll, this was original, or it was a later edition, because what they were drawing from was what was called a Q scroll. These were all sayings of Jesus, but in no order. So we would have had this idea of forgiveness and this pattern, but somebody decided that, hey, this is good to place in here. And so they put it in here later. Again, we don't know if it was part of the original or a later edition, but it just doesn't kind of fit the narrative, except for, or I should say, the flow of the text, but it does fit the full narrative of John. And so it was probably a part of John, but maybe not here. We get to stones at the end of the chapter, so somebody later on might have said, well, they're going to pick up stones to stone Jesus, so let's have this mirror happen between the two. But the narrative also fits the fuller version of what John is saying. So what do we see in this? Well, we see a woman accused of adultery, and you may immediately start to say, well, where's the man? Well, that's part of the issue, right? There is no man present, even though she committed adultery. You'll also notice that she's under a stoning, meaning this was kind of a mob mentality. There was no trial involved. This was the mob grabbing the woman, pulling her out, and getting ready to kill her without trial. So, remember, in chapter 7, it ends with Nicodemus saying, hey, if you're going to accuse somebody of something, you better have a trial of it. And the Jewish people just kind of blowing that off. So the very next scene, if this is part of the original, is a woman being accused of adultery without a trial happening. So it does fit in that kind of portion and that idea that here is in the past another way that those that were in leadership were ignoring the laws, or I should say the proper law of trial, and going into a mob mentality. But there's also this selective law that Jesus draws out. They're accusing her of adultery, yet they've also done things wrong in their past. And so we're going to pick on this one sin and call it, or one accusation, and I'll tell you why I corrected my language there. One accusation, but ignore the fact that I'm doing wrong as well. And so that comes into play throughout all of the Gospel of John, where certain things are picked up, but others are ignored. Remember, Jesus just talked about healing on the Sabbath and being accused of that, yet they circumcise on the Sabbath. So which is it? And so, as I said, it does fit the ideas of John. It just doesn't kind of fit the flow of John. So it would be a good reflection point in the midst of it. And that's why somebody probably put it here, is because it does fit well with what was just being talked about, but it does interrupt the flow of the text. So it might almost be at the end of the text or right before the Festival of Booths, like Jesus was on his way to the festival and this is what he witnessed. So that's what I mean. It fits all in the same day, but it just doesn't fit the flow. And so everybody puts their stones down and they move away. And Jesus says similar words that he said to the one that was healed by the pool, right? Go and kind of sin no more. A lot of people have made exception to that because it was a woman being talked to or something like that, but it's supposed to be reflective of everything that Jesus says, that this has happened in your life. So essentially see the light right now. And I was going to talk about this later because it's going to come up later in the text, but I want to remind you that in the Gospel of John, what sin is not an individual good or bad, but a full separation from God to the people. And so this ignoring of the connection between one to the other, but also each other to God. So it's this idea of a universal separation. There wasn't this idea or original notion of individual sins. And so that's why I corrected my language there, is that the woman's being accused of adultery, which is going against God. But when Jesus uses sin, he's talking about this idea of separation and ignoring what God's intent for the world is. And so we come back now to the Festival of Booths. And so if you remember, I said the Festival of Booths is a celebration that involved water and it involved light. And so when Jesus declared himself, I am the water of life, again, an I am statement, at that point, the water would have been poured over the altar. And so now we get this sense that light is being brought in. And Jesus, once again, does an I am statement. I am the light of the world. And so Jesus is saying, I am the two elements that you are giving thanks to. In other words, I am God. And that's why the people get so angry at him. And in verse 14 in particular, Jesus says, I'm going to be going away. And we get this idea of, where do you think you're going to go? Don't forget, Thomas is going to echo this same kind of notion later on in the Gospel of John. For those that remember, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Anybody that follows me will know the way that I'm going. And Thomas says, we don't know the way. How can we know this? So this is going to be echoed throughout all of this. And again, it feels like a trial that's going to happen from this point on, right? Jesus has been on trial in this whole section. And the people accuse him of testifying on his own behalf. Remember, I said you can't do this. You can't testify on your own behalf. You could only call witnesses to testify on behalf of you, for you. And so the leaders say that you're testifying on your own behalf and you can't do such a thing. And once again, Jesus points back to God. And it says that his hour had not yet come. This is going to be an echo throughout John. The hour isn't going to come until the third section of John, when we begin the Passover narrative. And so we know as Christians, since we know the end of the narrative, that the hour is the hour of glorification for Jesus, where Jesus reveals who he is to the world. But that time has not come, so no harm is going to come to him in this. In my notes, I said we go back to that idea of truth and knowing. And in my notes, I said this is a reminder about what sin is. And so we get that notion of the people staying in the place of unknowing. This isn't a condemnation of Jewish people. This is a condemnation. This is saying that you're choosing to stay where you want to be. In the place of unknowing. And therefore, that place of unknowing is staying in that disconnect from God. Therefore, you're staying in sin. Again, John is not talking about individual sins, but this kind of universal one, echoing John 1, which was about the creator of the cosmos. So Jesus is only concerned with the big matters of the world. We get a note about Jesus being lifted up. The first time it was echoing the idea of the serpent in the desert, and now Jesus talks about being lifted up again. As Christians, we know that Jesus is talking about the cross. They don't know this, though, and so this is the second time this is mentioned. There will be 3 times altogether before Jesus is lifted up. And so just that pattern of 3 that's going to come throughout the Gospel of John. So this is the second message of Jesus being lifted up. And then we get this weird crowd response, right? We've never been slaves to anybody. Part of the core tenet of Judaism, especially during this time, is the Moses and Exodus narrative. And as I said, the Gospel of John likes to draw from Exodus a lot. And so what is at stake here? Well, the Jewish people just denied that they've been slaves to anybody. Do you remember the Exodus narrative? They were slaves in Egypt until God frees them. And so here they are denying the very essence of who they are, is what's at stake here. They're being hypocrites once again. How we weren't slaves to anybody, and Jesus, you could almost see him sitting there going, are you sure about that? Because that's what I mean. The Exodus means everything to the people. And then the expulsion from Babylon by Babylon means everything to the people. And so the idea of being an enslaved people who were kicked out of their own homeland, whom God sent them and provided for them, and then brought them back to their homeland, is the core tenet to Judaism. And so for them to say this, it's pretty bad. I mean, this is a deep denial of who they are. And so then we bring up Abraham at this point, and it seems odd, but Jesus is kind of reminding them of who they are, right? The covenant came through Abraham, that they would be a people of God through being children of Abraham. And he reminds them, if you're following what Abraham is doing, you'd be following me right now. Abraham knew who God was and followed God. And so Jesus is saying, you are not seeing me as God in this. And therefore, you are not following what Abraham has intended for you. You are not being children of God. And therefore, God is not your father. The devil is your father. And I want to pause there because, again, this line has been used as a way of anti-Semitism because the notion of the devil has transformed throughout the centuries and throughout time. But if God is truth, in this case, the devil is falsehood. It doesn't mean that they're evil. It doesn't mean anything like that. And again, because this has been used so often in anti-Semitic notions that Jewish people are the devil, this is not what Jesus' intent was here. This was to say, if you're following the truth, you will know God. But since you're not following the truth, you are a child of the devil, or you're a child of falsehood would be the better way of kind of wrapping that. Since you aren't following the truth, you must be following falsehood. And so you're missing what's happening here. So I want to be really clear on that. Again, the Gospel of John is not an anti-Semitic gospel. It was never intended to be, since John was Jewish. The movement of early Christianity was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. And so later on, when Christians do this supersessionalism, meaning somehow Christianity becomes better than Judaism. Don't ask me how that came about, but later interpretation would kind of throw this on there, including Luther. We have to own that as Lutherans, but this would be added on. But this was not the intent of the original gospel. What Jesus is saying is you're not following truth, therefore you're following falsehood. There's also this weird statement that's saying you're not 50, so how could you know? This was some teachings in the past thought that once Abraham kind of reached 50, he can see into the future. That is missed in translation now and kind of has gone by the wayside. So we don't pick up on that. That's why we need historians to say, hey, this is what was going on there. And so I'm just going to rely on historians at this time, that one of the old teachings was that as soon as Abraham reached kind of 50-ish, he could see into the future. And so if Jesus was comparing himself to Abraham and talking about the future, the people didn't understand, because he was at this time he would have been 32, since he lives until 33, so he was just 32. So what does he know about seeing the future? He's not the right age yet. And then it says that the stones were there and they were ready to stone him, but he just walks on by. And so that's why I said this is why the stoning of the woman could fit in here, or somebody placed it in here, because the stones had to come from somewhere, right? So if we can't stone the woman, why can't we stone Jesus here? Because it is the week before Holy Week, and I know I'm way over time today, but I'm just going to share this. Follow the crowds. So some of you, if you're watching this the week before Holy Week and you're going to come to the Easter and Good Friday and Maundy Thursday services, I'm just putting this extra little note for you. Follow the crowds. So this is the crowds that were calling him to be king after he had fed them. And then they're going to switch all the way a few years later to calling for his death and crucifying him. And so this is the progression of what the crowds have been doing. And so the crowds are losing faith in Jesus. Some are believing, as the little note in this chapter said, but the crowd is not being swayed. In fact, they're being swayed further and further away, because the Gospel of John is all about who sees and who doesn't see. So at the very end of the Gospel, right, when Jesus is crucified, who is left? Well, Mary, more than likely Lazarus, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that's it. Everybody else is scattered until Jesus goes to them. And so we'll talk about that more in time, but since it is Holy, or the week before Holy Week, I want you to just kind of follow the crowds, because we're going to go from Palm Sunday through Easter. And so just think of these narratives as you talk about the crowds. With luck, I should see you next week. If not, have a great Holy Week and a great Easter. Take care. Bye.